Welcome to PCM Podcasts, a series of informative podcasts with experts in their fields, exploring a wide range of topics in payments. The theme for today's session is Wallet Payments in 2021, COVID's Shift to Digital. As the fallout from the pandemic becomes clearer, we want to take a deeper look at the mobile wallet market. Based on research conducted by Accourt and supported by the GSMA and NTT, we're going to review current and emerging trends in the European wallet market and reveal what's on the cards for 2021, including mobile wallet growth, QR codes, and more. I'd like to introduce our expert for the day, Vaughan Collie. Vaughan is a managing partner at Accourt, a payments consultancy based in London. Vaughan, welcome.
Hello, Alex. It's good to join you today.
I think let's just jump straight into the first question. Do you think that the consumer shift in attitudes away from cash and into contactless, wallets, etc., is a sustainable trend?
I do think so, Alex. I think the trend towards digital was always happening, and I think COVID has just really helped to accelerate the agenda in digital for a lot of players, not only in the payments market. And of course, that's put pressure on some very old legacy infrastructures, but also the disruptors, the new fintechs, etc., have been able to capitalize on that to an extent as well. But we don't see that trend reversing. This was always on the cards. I think COVID has just helped to accelerate that.
What's driving the usage of wallets and QR codes in Europe?
I think obviously with the pandemic as it is globally, not only in Europe, there has been a marked drop in face-to-face transactions as various geographies have dealt with the pandemic in different ways. But in UK and Europe, we've seen a series of lockdowns across geographies, which has meant that face-to-face transactions have almost fallen off a cliff and almost dried up entirely, which then leaves the digital channels. And that's where we've seen a lot of growth in particular areas. And so that's been very important. Now, where we have seen face-to-face transactions, cash has almost entirely disappeared as well, because retailers and other businesses have largely tried to avoid accepting cash. So they've started accepting contactless payments or digital alternatives. And so we've seen a growth in contactless transactions. We've also seen in the UK, the contactless transaction limit raised to £45 for pinless transactions. So that really has driven different behavior, not only in the face-to-face world, but obviously in the digital world as well. I think it's probably worth also mentioning that we're starting to see a lot more interest in QR code payments technologies, where in the Asian markets in particular, QR codes have been prevalent for some time. A lot of those markets don't see much card use. They've really used digital wallets fronted by QR codes in some format. We're starting to see some of that coming across into the UK and Europe. And obviously with the pandemic having accelerated different behaviors, we're starting to see QR codes starting to emerge in different guises. And one of the prime examples in the UK, for example, is the NHS test and trace app and supporting infrastructure, where that has meant that the population as a whole is starting to get quite used to using QR codes, if they hadn't done already, for various uses. And we are seeing other players in these very card-dominant markets. The UK is a good example, and other European markets as well, where traditionally cards and NFC or contactless has been the primary payment mechanism for these types of payment transactions in the face-to-face world. We're now starting to see QR codes enter into that. Some good examples, PayPal has recently introduced, through its iZettle acquisition, it's recently introduced QR code payments to all iZettle merchants. So you can now, as a as a customer for any retailer that has iZettle, you can pay via QR code. Apple Pay has introduced a QR code equivalent in various geographies, and we expect to see that fairly ubiquitously deployed elsewhere. And so we are seeing a very interesting mix where traditional card-centric markets are starting to see more and more QR code payment mechanisms emerging. And that's not to say, though, that QR codes is going to overtake cards anytime soon. There's still a huge dependency on card payments in some of these UK and European markets. I think it's worth also pointing out that for these QR code payment methods, many of them back into some form of digital wallet, as you mentioned at the top. And those wallets will have various funding mechanisms. Either the wallet will have a balance in the wallet itself, so some sort of funding that's been dropped into that wallet and is accessible that way, or it will back into a bank account, so the funding mechanism comes directly from a bank account. Or the last alternative we see, which in the UK and European markets is probably most prevalent, is some sort of card that is lodged in the wallet as the funding mechanism. And then the card is used in that way. And so there is kind of a complementary fit between the QR code front-end mechanism and the card as the funding mechanism.
What will sustain the growth of wallets and QR code use by consumers in Europe?
That's a good question. I think one of the aspects is getting users comfortable with QR code as a new payment modality. So that initial hurdle of people kind of knowing what to do when they see a QR code. And I think we're well down the track with that now, with various implementations around QR codes, not only NHS Test and Trace, not only payments. But we're starting to see, and have done for a number of months now, we're starting to see organizations start to implement this type of technology in restaurants, bars, pubs, etc., where you are trying to minimize contact in the pandemic context, minimize contact with others. And so this sort of concept of touchless commerce is starting to emerge, where you order from your table, you pay from your table. There's no need to go and circulate, stand in queues to pay, etc. So I think that's a behavior that we see continuing to grow, and maybe it's been accelerated by the pandemic, but we see that continuing to grow. I think another byproduct of the pandemic has been when you look at contactless payments. Obviously, a lot of the card-based products have been promoted as minimizing or eliminating contact. But if you have a look at the contactless transaction and you have a look at how people actually complete contactless transactions, generally they will touch their card to the card reader, or in the UK and particularly London scenario, where you have a look at people traveling on the tube, there's a whole lot of rubbing of cards on card readers and all of that type of behavior, which is clearly not contactless, although the card can operate entirely contactlessly. And that's where a lot of the QR code implementations have centered as well, to highlight the fact that they are completely contactless. There isn't even a touching of a phone to a reader or any such behavior. It is literally entirely contactless. So those are the types of behaviors that we see creating that sustainability. We also see, and this we've seen in the Asian markets in particular, is the introduction of QR code payments as a very low-cost payment modality. So where card payments have a set range or types of fees at varying levels depending on the transaction, the retailer, risk, etc. We have seen the introduction of QR code payments that are low or no cost transactions out there, and even PayPal's implementation has been a low cost, admittedly only until roughly March next year. but we see the opportunity for this type of payment to, under certain circumstances, be a lower cost payment type, which we would then expect to drive certain behaviors for retailers who are cost conscious for those on those transaction economics, which, to be fair, has got to be most retailers out there.
So let's discuss QR codes versus contactless. Are contactless payments really contactless?
Yes, absolutely. I think we talked briefly about the different types of funding models, and there is absolutely an opportunity now, in particular with open banking, not only in UK, but more broadly, where we have the opportunity for that QR code to be a front end directly either into a banking app or directly into a bank account. So the user journey used to be relatively clunky in terms of unlocking your phone, typing in a PIN or using Face ID or Touch ID or so on to get to the app and then to find the QR code scanner, etc. We've seen a lot of very streamlined user journeys that make that quite a slick user experience. It's still not entirely frictionless, and I think that it could be argued it's still not as slick as the contactless or NFC type transactions that we see, where you pull out your phone and you hold it near the reader and you're away. So I think there's still work to be done on that angle, and that's why we say card payment transactions are not disappearing anytime soon, and certainly not in the NFC or contactless space.
How do QR code presentment and technology in Europe compare to the Asian model?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fact that those organizations are looking to target their customer base, wherever that customer base may be, and they've recognized that in the Asian markets, QR codes dominate. So therefore, if you want that ubiquity or that offering, Apple Pay in, for example, Japan needs to operate differently perhaps than Apple Pay does in the UK. Same in Indonesia, Malaysia, etc., where QR codes dominate and perhaps the traditional international card networks don't dominate. So that's where obviously they are trying to service that customer need with a ubiquitous product that operates irrespective of where the customer is and enables them to transact in that particular manner. So I think it's very much customer centric in terms of what they're trying to do and create that ubiquity. I think also that they have recognized that there is an ecosystem to tap into here, where you have a look at Apple Pay and then that leveraged the wallet that Apple already had. And then we're starting to see the equivalent of Apple cards being issued and so on. So they are starting to look at ecosystem plays where potentially they could be creating a closed loop scheme of their own, where if you're using an Apple card or something similar and there's a QR code or an Apple Pay NFC transaction, it could be quite interesting as to where all of that goes. It's still early days yet, but and make no mistake, there's been a few bites at the cherry, so to speak, for those organizations. So it's fascinating to watch nonetheless.
What is the potential impact for the banking sector if QR and wallets continue to grow at pace?
I think it's definitely an opportunity for banks and their customers. I think for me, the question is disintermediation and that brand disintermediation, because if the customer recognizes the payment functionality as that's the brand that's important in the transaction, then they almost don't recognize the fact, or they're not really reminded of the fact that that transaction ultimately comes from their bank account. I think it's ultimately those funds have to come from somewhere. And typically for the banked population, those funds will come from a bank account somewhere. So I think there's clearly a role for banks to play in that, because they have the customers who have the bank accounts from which the funding comes. In the unbanked population, of course, that equation is slightly different, and the mechanism is slightly different in terms of how funding goes from cash to digital. But that's a separate topic on its own. But I don't think it's an either or. I think open banking unlocks a load of opportunity. One of the key opportunities that people are focusing on is open banking could enable a lower cost ecosystem, and that's not the only opportunity for open banking, but that could be one of the primary drivers that starts to enable retailers and others in the value chain to start offering more competitive pricing than perhaps the dominant card players at the moment. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a very healthy competitive tension between both of those sides of the arguments.
Thanks, Vaughan. That's great. Okay, so I have one final question for you, and it's based around the report that you did for the GSMA. I'm wondering if there was anything that was particularly standout, any kind of wow moment from that report that you'd like to talk about.
I think the thing that stood out to us is how advanced some of the Asian markets, and obviously China, everyone knows China through WeChat Pay and Alipay, have driven this payment method for some time. But the interesting thing is that the payment wasn't the core objective. Payment was a byproduct of a very healthy, thriving ecosystem that offered all sorts of other functionality to the user base, be it messaging, be it other financial services products, etc. And payment almost came to being because it was a necessity to monetize those products. So payments wasn't the reason that that success came about. It was almost a byproduct. Now, when we contrast that to some of the other initiatives that we see around the world, people are so very focused on payments as the driving objective. And how do you then get customers excited about payments and so on? And from our perspective, that's quite a difficult thing to do. So our key takeaway in that aspect is once you've got a compelling product or a compelling ecosystem of value for your customers, they are obviously engaged and they're looking to engage with you. And then ultimately, hopefully, they are going to want to make some sort of purchase from you, be it a product or a service or equivalent. And at that point, you don't want to make it difficult. You want it to be very easy for them and almost an invisible part of the transaction or an invisible part of the experience, which I think is where organizations like Uber and others have done well. You know, payments isn't central to your experience. It's a very easy byproduct of that. And I think that is where we see a fundamental difference between what's happening outside of those core markets and elsewhere in the world where others are trying to emulate that type of success.
Vaughan, fantastic. Thanks so much for those wonderful explanations and your insight and analysis of the marketplace. I just want to say thank you very much for your time today. It's been great talking to you, and look forward to seeing you in the very near future and spending some time with you. Vaughan Collie from Accourt, thanks very much.